Greetings to you, Justice Russell and the honorable members of the Montana Supreme Court. I am Julia Minch-Rumberg, a new law clerk serving Justice Russell. Today, I will be addressing the First Amendment issues raised in Montana v. Montana Grown Bison Incorporated. First, I will provide you with a brief summary of the background of this case. Second, I will describe the First Amendment issues at hand. Third, I will explain any relevant tests from the United States Supreme Court precedent on these issues. Finally, I will apply U.S. precedent to the current case and advise you on an appropriate ruling here. Finally, I will discuss the potential policy implications of my recommendation. For your convenience, I will provide pin sites for relevant case law to our mutual text in Erwin Chemerinsky's Constitutional Law, 5th edition from 2017, as edited by Rachel E. Barkow et al., as well as citations to the relevant reporter. In addition, I will provide a transcript of this presentation, which will also include citations to the relevant case law I provide here. First, a brief background of the current case. The state attorney general sued Montana Grown Bison Incorporated for violating the Montana Consumer Protection Act with deceptive advertising. The AG's office argues that Montana Grown Bison's meat is not Montana grown because the bison migrate to Wyoming during the winter months to forage. Montana Grown Bison counters that their advertising is not deceptive. They further argue that their advertising is protected under the First Amendment. Whether their advertising is deceptive or a violation of the Montana Consumer Protection Act is outside of the scope of this presentation. This presentation will only address Montana Grown Bison's claim that their advertising is protected under the First Amendment. Now, the First Amendment issues at hand. Montana Grown Bison asserts that their advertising is protected under the First Amendment. Although this assertion is generally correct, the Supreme Court has held that advertising and other forms of commercial speech are entitled to a lesser degree of protection under the First Amendment than other forms of speech. The court first defined advertising as commercial speech in Bolger v. Young's Drug Products Corporation at 463 U.S. 60, text 1479, and that's from 1983. In a later case, Central Hudson Gas and Electricity Corporation v. Public Service Commission of New York, that's from 447 U.S. 557, or text at 1487. I'll refer to that from now on as Central Hudson. In that case, the court further explained its reasoning. Since commercial transactions are traditionally subject to government regulation, there is a common sense distinction between speech proposing a commercial transaction and other varieties of speech. That's from the text at 1488. Thus, the question presented in this case is whether the Montana Consumer Protection Act, as applied to Montana Grown Bison, is an acceptable restriction on commercial speech under the First Amendment. Now, in Central Hudson, the Supreme Court established a three-pronged test for evaluating restrictions on commercial speech. That's still from the text at 1488. First, the court must determine if the speech is protected by the First Amendment at all. It must concern a lawful activity and may not be misleading. With non-commercial speech, false speech may be protected because erroneous statement is inevitable in free debate. That's from New York Times v. Sullivan, 376 U.S. 254, or text at 1492. And that case is from 1964. In contrast to non-commercial speech, commercial speech is actually subject to a higher standard. There can be no constitutional objection to the suppression of commercial messages that do not accurately inform the public about lawful activity. That's from Central Hudson again, 447 U.S. 557, or text at 1488. According to Erwin Chemerinsky, this distinction is based on a judgment that such speech is more harmful, less likely to be chilled because of the profit motive, and more easily verified than most other types of expression. That's from the text at 1492. The second prong of the Central Hudson test requires the government to assert a substantial interest that will be achieved through the restriction. That's from Central Hudson, 447 U.S. 557, text at 1488. Furthermore, the regulatory technique must be in proportion to that interest. Thus, the more compelling the government's interest, the more restrictive a regulation may be. The third prong of the Central Hudson test requires the limitation on expression to be designed carefully to achieve the state's goal. In Central Hudson, the court outlined two criteria that must be met to show a regulation was carefully designed. First, the regulation must directly advance the asserted government interest. The regulation may not be sustained if it provides only ineffective or remote support for the government's purpose. Second, the regulation may not be more extensive than necessary to serve that interest. This prong has undergone several changes in subsequent cases. You can see, for example, Board of Trustees of the State University of New York v. Fox, that's 492 U.S. 469, Reuben v. Coors Brewing Company, that's at 514 U.S. 476. You can also see 44 Liquor Mart Incorporated v. Rhode Island, that's 517 U.S. 484. But most recently, the most recent Supreme Court articulation of the third prong was laid out in Greater New Orleans Broadcasting Association versus United States at 527 U.S. 173, or text at 1491. In 1999, the Supreme Court stated, the government is not required to employ the least restrictive means conceivable, but it must demonstrate narrow tailoring of the challenge regulation to the asserted interest, a fit that is not necessarily perfect, but reasonable, that represents not necessarily the single best disposition, but one whose scope is in proportion to the interest served. Thus, the third prong generally requires the regulation to be narrowly tailored to directly advancing the government's asserted interest, but it does not require the regulation to be the least restrictive alternative available. Now, an analysis of the current case. As discussed earlier, the question presented in this case is whether the Montana Consumer Protection Act, as applied to the Montana-grown bison, is an acceptable restriction on commercial speech under the First Amendment. The Montana Consumer Protection Act would survive a facial challenge under the First Amendment, as it simply encodes the first prong of the Central Hudson test. Unlawful, misleading commercial speech is not protected by the First Amendment. However, whether the AG's use of the Act in the current case is appropriate cuts a closer question. The first prong of the Central Hudson test, whether the commercial speech is not misleading and supports a lawful activity, presents an interesting challenge to this court. First, there is no claim that Montana-grown bison's harvesting and sale of bison meat is unlawful. However, does Montana-grown bison have a protected right to express its belief that a bison living in Montana 9 months of the year is Montana-grown? In the non-commercial realm, the U.S. Supreme Court established that erroneous statements must be protected if the freedoms of expression are to have the breathing space that they need to survive. That again is from New York Times 376 U.S. 254, or text at 1492. Thus, Montana-grown bison's right to express this belief would normally be protected. Is it protected in a commercial context? Since whether Montana-grown bison is right or wrong is actually up for debate, I would argue that it is protected. If a person maintained a dwelling in Montana and Wyoming, they would be considered a resident of Montana for legal purposes. I see no reason to draw a distinction for bison. This raises another interesting question. If Montana-grown bison has a right to express that its bison is Montana-grown, can this court still hold that asserting such a belief on its packaging is deceptive to consumers under the Montana Consumer Protection Act? Answering this question would require delving into Montana Supreme Court precedent on the act itself, which is outside of the scope of this presentation. Thus, in evaluating the First Amendment claim alone, I recommend that this court find that this advertisement is not misleading and supports a lawful activity. The second prong of Central Hudson requires a showing that the government has a substantial interest proportionally supported by the restriction on speech. On its face, consumer protection is a substantial government interest. One facet of consumer protection is ensuring that consumers know what they are buying, both in terms of quality and in comparing to other similarly situated products. The best way for consumers to do this before purchasing a product is by evaluating and comparing labels and advertisements. Thus, restricting speech in labels and advertisements is proportionate to the government's interest in consumer protection. Here, the specific question is whether the government has a substantial interest in ensuring that bison is accurately labeled as to its source. I would argue that it does. First, supporting locally sourced food products increases the resiliency of local communities, which is especially important in predominantly rural state like Montana. Second, supporting locally sourced food products decreases regional dependency on fossil fuels for transport and refrigeration of food from distant lands. Third, supporting locally sourced food products decreases the environmental and traffic impacts of transporting foods. And finally, the increasing popularity of locally sourced foods makes the sourcing of a food product a relevant factor in consumer decision-making. I therefore recommend that this court find that the government has a substantial interest in restricting speech as to the source of food, and that regulating labels and advertisements is a proportionate means of achieving this goal. The third prong of the Central Hudson test, as discussed earlier, generally requires the regulation to be narrowly tailored to directly advancing the government's asserted interest. But it does not require the regulation to be the least restrictive alternative available. As I just discussed, evaluating labels and advertisements is one of the best ways a consumer can evaluate a product before purchasing it. Thus, regulating speech in labels and advertisements directly advances the government's interests in consumer protection generally and in disclosing the source of food specifically. However, is this application of the Act narrowly tailored to those asserted interests? I would argue that it is. Whether Montana-grown bison's assertion that its bison is Montana-grown is deceptive to consumers or not, the state has only one way to ensure labels indicating the source of food are accurate: control the speech of the label. I therefore recommend that this court find that this regulation is narrowly tailored to directly advance the government's asserted interest. Having found that the Montana Consumer Protection Act has met the three prongs of the Central Hudson test, I recommend that this court find that the Montana Consumer Protection Act does not violate the First Amendment as applied to Montana-grown bison. Finally, what are the potential policy ramifications of this recommendation? Since I recommend finding that the Montana Consumer Protection Act does not violate the First Amendment as applied here, Montana-grown bison's speech, even speech it believes is true, may be limited because other people believe its speech to be deceptive. This leaves Montana-grown bison in an awkward position, since under the Act, it can be punished because of what other people subjectively believe about its statements on its packaging. In the world of free speech generally, this would be unconscionable. No person or government should have the right to punish others because of what they truly believe. However, the commercial world must be held to a higher standard. They are not simply selling beliefs, they are selling products that consumers choose based on ideas presented on the product's labels and advertisements. What consumers understand from packaging is subjectively more important than what the producer meant to convey. As Justice Scalia said in Fox, 492 U.S. 469, texted 1490, commercial speech enjoys a limited measure of protection, commensurate with its subordinate position in the scale of First Amendment values, and is subject to modes of regulation that might be impermissible in the realm of non-commercial expression. Thus, although Montana-grown bison may balk at the idea that their bison are residents of Montana and Wyoming, the state's responsibility is to ensure consumers relying on their labeling for accurate information that they want to know get what they rightfully deserve.